I've been a Pistons fan for a long time, and I've realized that you can get to a certain point where you realize exactly what time of year it is just by what kind of BS you see on Twitter. And I went on this morning and realized that content creators are yet again having to defend why Troy Weaver isn't on the hot seat. And I went, oh dear Lord, we are just waiting desperately for the draft, aren't we? And that's exactly why we got to have a conversation today. With that, be sure you like this video, subscribe to From Half Court if you like this type of content, and also be sure to share with your friend and join in the conversation in the comment section down below. But with that, here's why Troy Weaver's not in any conversations to be in the hot seat. First of all, mind the fact that Troy Weaver literally just signed an extension this past offseason because of the work that he's done. Mind the fact that Troy Weaver started with Sekou Doumbouya, Bruce Brown, and Luke Kennard as the main pieces that he began his rebuild with. Mind the fact that 2 of his 4 years in Detroit had the COVID pandemic that he had to get through. He had an unprecedented bag of chips that he was dealt going into the casino. Essentially, imagine going into the World Series of Poker and you're going in with about $500 and everyone else has $500,000. Like, for a lack of better terms, that's how Troy Weaver started his rebuild compared to teams, say, like the Oklahoma City Thunder, who have a metric ton of picks, a historic amount of picks. The Utah Jazz, who got the exact same thing from a really stupid Timberwolves team who wanted Rudy Gobert. You had other teams as well, like Cleveland, who were able to go and get top assets from trades that they made as well. Like, you can go around the league and you can look at examples. I mean, even Orlando, with albeit not much success they've had over the last 20 years either, they still had guys like Aaron Gordon and Nikola Vucevic that they could trade to kickstart their rebuild, to get multiple picks, to go out and get guys like Franz Wagner, to put alongside players like Paolo Banchero. So when you look at the fact that Troy Weaver, despite all of this, has managed to go get 3 straight years of all rookie level talent, the fact that he's added as much, if not more, talent than some of these teams over the last 3 years in the draft, you can really only look at one player as a maybe a miss. But even then, Killian Hayes is still having nights where he's having really good output. So you can't necessarily write off his career and definitively say where he's at just yet. I mean, for God's sakes, Troy Weaver's even going out and trading for players who are immediately showing impacts right as they're getting into the frickin' building. James Wiseman has been phenomenal in his time as a Piston and went out last night against Miami and put up 22 points and 13 rebounds. He's averaging 16 points and 11 boards, 54% shooting from the field over his last 6 games. And a lot of it's been, good consistent play, solid screens, good looks from playmakers, but also his ability to finish over defenders because of his size and his physicality. It's apparent that James Wiseman can play basketball. That's never been something that's been in question, but the fact that he's able to actually spread his wings, play in a system that makes more sense for him in Detroit, where he's not being asked to be too much of a perimeter focused player, I think it just fits him a lot better than it does Golden State. I do, however, still have serious questions about the fit with him and Marvin Bagley, because if you did watch that game last night against the Miami Heat and the Pistons, you go specifically and you look at the box scores and you almost look at the fact that in order for these guys to excel, they almost essentially have to trade off and don't really know what to do themselves when the other player's thriving. A specific example of this, you go and look at this game. In the first half, Marvin Bagley went off and he had 12 of his 14 points in the first half. James Wiseman only went for 4. But then you go in the second half, and that's exactly when James Wiseman played his best basketball, putting up 18, but Marvin was only able to put up 2 points on 1 of 4 shots. So right when Wiseman went off and started thriving, right when he started playing his best game, was when Marvin Bagley was essentially taken out of the equation. And granted, Bagley was still able to, have certain effects, but even then in his 14 minutes of play, he only had 1 board. And I think it's kind of it speaks to the fact that I think James Wiseman and Marvin Bagley kind of both had this similar issue where they don't necessarily know what to do when they don't have the basketball in their hands. I think, Bagley and Wiseman have gotten better at being more active and setting better screens. I think Wiseman especially has improved at setting screens since his time and getting in Detroit, but I still think that at the end of the day, what it's going to come down to for both of those players and the longevity on this team and, who I ultimately think is going to be here in the long term is I think it's going to come down to that defensive ceiling and which player can bring that consistent effort on a night-to-night basis. I personally think if I had to pick between the two, if I was a betting man, I would personally say James Wiseman is earning that spot with the play that he's been putting up, especially since he's coming to Detroit. He's been more consistent than Marvin Bagley, even since Bagley's come back. And sure, Bagley had those 2 really good games at the beginning when he came back from injury, but it's just been really choppy up and down ever since. So I'm interested to see how these guys continue to play together down the stretch this season, but unfortunately, it hasn't looked great so far. And I think last night, just looking at the box scores, it doesn't necessarily always tell the entire story. In fact, I think you have to look, a lot of times you have to look deeper than that, but it's often pretty telling when players can only really excel when the other person isn't really able to, and especially when Marvin Bagley and James Wiseman have overlapping skill sets, have overlapping desires, and both have shared ways that they like to get theirs. They both love to dominate in the post. They both have similar move sets. You know what I mean? It's just they're so similar. And I also think during that Heat game, I still think you're seeing a lot of different reminders that our young big men are showing a lot of growth and a lot of opportunities to grow as well. My guy Bryce Motor City Hoops brought up a really good point with Jalen Durham about the fact that Jalen Durham is a dominant guy on the boards, especially on the offensive end, but there's times where there's just that lack of defensive awareness, especially on the defensive boards. Right here you can see Jalen Durham gives up those 2 straight offensive boards. That's 2 more opportunities right there for them to go and get a basket. So I think especially with Jalen Durham, he's shown that he could be a dominant rebounder. He is a dominant rebounder, especially on the offensive glass. But there's just those times on the defensive end, like those little miscues and miscommunications. And this is something that applies to not just Jalen Durham, but to James Wiseman, Marvin Bagley, all of the bigs that are on this roster. You have to be able to keep that attentiveness and that attention to detail of knowing, when you have to box out, when you have to bring that physicality, when you have to bring that presence. And, ultimately, I think, a lot of these guys are showing improvements in those areas. And I mean, the team has gotten better, especially on the defensive end as the season has gone on. However, it was a bummer. Jalen Durham, yet again, did sustain another injury in the game against the Miami Heat last night. It was a bummer to see him go down. They did say that he was feeling woozy after the game. So more than likely, I would imagine Jalen Durham is going to have to enter concussion protocols. We don't know if this could be the end of Jalen Durham's rookie season. I could very much see a reality where that could be the case. However, if this is something that he can quickly recover from and hopefully, feel okay, hopefully we can see some more Jalen Durham before this season winds down. However, at this time, folks, the Pistons have just 10 games remaining. And other than an opportunity to go and face Sadiq Bey, go and face off against the Milwaukee Bucks, down the stretch this season, the Pistons are playing, for pride. They're playing for players competing for roster spots, for player development, for growth. Guys like Jaden Ivey are going out and trying to set a strong statement to go out into this summer so he can work and come back and be better in next season. But I think ultimately for Detroit, you look at the fact that they are essentially in the spot to get the best odds for Victor Wembanyama this offseason. And even though that is not the plan that you had for this season, that is not the goal that you set out for at the beginning of this year, those are some pretty good odds to have. And so no matter what happens to the Detroit Pistons in these final 10 games, change is coming in the coming months, and positive changes are coming because whether the Pistons get the number 1 overall pick or a top 3 pick, they're going to be getting a all-star potential talent this upcoming summer. And then you talk about the different options that they have in free agency. I know there's been a conversation about what the Pistons should do, and I know that there's a lot of people having a conversation about how aggressive should Troy Weaver be? What are the moves that he should make? And I know that a lot of people are really impatient and want to see this team, start to be really good as soon as next year. But I would argue you can still make some really good moves for this team, and you can make positive changes without sacrificing your future as well. And regardless of whoever Detroit ends up with this offseason, the Detroit Pistons are going to be inherently better this next season because of the fact that Cade Cunningham is going to be on the court. He's going to be ready to go. He's going to be able to play opening night. And with the ability to go out this offseason and to actually play basketball, work on his game, shake off that rust, I think we're going to see Cade Cunningham go out and kick ass exactly the way we expected him to this past season. Sure, we can look at that as a potential bump in the road for his development, but at the same time, we could also look at it as a potential blessing in disguise with the developments we've seen in Jaden Ivey this season, with how much he's been able to handle the ball and the playmaker that he has become. And then you also talk about all the opportunities Killian has had as well. I think this year we've learned a lot about Killian Hayes, especially with the consistency, the ebbs and flows, the highs and lows, exactly what can get to him and exactly what his potential is in this league. I still think we see a lot of reasons to be optimistic about what Killian Hayes can be for this team. But ultimately, there's a lot of reasons to be optimistic, and that is exactly why you're not firing Troy Weaver, because Troy Weaver has acquired more young talent for this roster, better talent in the draft, than any general manager has in the Pistons for the last 25 years plus. Straight up. In the last 4 years, he's gotten more talent. And as much as I love Joe Dumars, Troy Weaver has gotten more talent in the last 2 years in the draft alone than Joe Dumars ever got in his tenure drafting for the Detroit Pistons. I don't have pleasure in saying that. Joe Dumars did a lot of amazing things, but his work was done in trades. His work was done in free agency. His work was done going out and getting veterans and guys who can go out and be leaders. Troy Weaver is an eye for talent. He's a scout. This is what he was brought to do. And you think he doesn't know what he has in front of him? You don't think he doesn't understand how aggressive he can be this offseason? I'm just being patient, because the same people that are all crying for Troy Weaver's demise are going to be proclaiming for a freaking statue for this man after free agency and after the draft. So I'm just going to wait. But with that, if you're frustrated with where the Pistons are at, let me know why in the comment section down below. But also, what are your thoughts on what Troy Weaver's done thus far as the Pistons general manager? But with that, folks, that is going to do it for today's video. I thank you, as always, for tuning in. Be sure you're subscribed so you're not missing some epic content that's coming for this channel. But with that, I will catch you guys next time. From Half Court, be sure you're subscribed.